The palace gardens below glowed with hundreds of lanterns, floating like captive stars above white marble fountains. Laughter drifted up from the dignitaries still dancing in orchestra of wealth and whispered alliances. High above them on the private terrace stood Fariha, emerald gown catching every light, every admiring glance that might rise this far. But none of it reached her heart tonight. Not with Zamir standing beside her, stiff in a perfectly tailored suit, voice low and even as he delivered a blade disguised as gentle courtesy. "Tomorrow," he said, eyes fixed on the balustrade, "instead of her the council will announce our annulment, as agreed." So calm, so measured, as if they were discussing quarterly profits instead of the death of something fragile between them. Fariha inhaled slowly, her spine straight, expression regal. She refused to let her shaking breath show. "Is that why you brought me out here?" Her tone cut like glass. "So you could give me one last reminder that this was always a performance." A faint muscle jumped in Zamir's jaw. He still didn't look at her. "I thought it would be more dignified to tell you myself, rather than let you hear it from palace aides or tomorrow's headlines." "How gracious of you," she murmured, bitterly elegant. He finally met her eyes, then dark, searching, but frustratingly blank. "Fariha, don't turn this into something it's not. We had a contract. It protected your father's ventures and secured my board's faith. You knew the terms." Her laugh was soft and humorless. "Ah yes, the terms. 1 year of dinners, charity galas, smiling for photographs while they all whispered how beautifully matched we were." She stepped closer, words sharp now, eyes bright with unshed tears. "Tell me, Zamir, were you always this good at compartmentalizing? Or did you have to practice ignoring what your heart was telling you?" His brows knit together, a tiny crack in the fortress of his composure. "This isn't about hearts. It never was. It was about survival. You knew that better than anyone. I didn't lie to you." "No," she breathed. "You didn't have to. You let me fill the silence with my own hopes." A long silence stretched between them, thick as the humid night. Somewhere below, the orchestra shifted into a softer melody. Zamir's eyes dropped to her hands clutching the stone railing, knuckles white, nails perfect and gleaming against the ancient marble. When he finally spoke, his voice was rougher. "It's better this way. For both of us. The less entangled we are, then why do you sound like you're trying to convince yourself?" she shot back, voice cracking despite herself. His gaze snapped up to hers, startled, vulnerable for a fraction of a second. Then it was gone, replaced by that cool, impenetrable calm she'd come to hate. "Because," he said quietly, "someone in this marriage had to keep their head clear. Or we both would have drowned." Their character traits shown here. For how proud, refuses to let him see how badly she's breaking. Sarcastic, quick with sharp retorts that mask her ache. Still hopeful enough to hurt because she allowed herself to dream. Zamir controlled, precise with his words, trying to keep the messy emotional fallout contained. Views everything through a lens of duty, survival, consequences. His small tells, jaw muscle, rougher voice, brief vulnerability, reveal that under all his composure, he does care deeply and it terrifies him. The boardroom in El Marwan's financial district was a monument to cold elegance. Smooth black marble table, high-backed chairs lined in silver, towering windows that looked out over the glittering sprawl of the capital. During the day, the sun struck the glass so brightly it felt like standing inside a polished blade. At night, the lights of the city gleamed below like a nest of jewels. Now, it was dusk. The horizon burned in bruised shades of crimson and violet. Inside, silence pressed heavy, broken only by the faint ticking of a gilded clock. Fariha sat with her spine perfectly straight, hands folded in her lap over her cream silk blouse. Her father, Shahbaz Rahman, sat beside her, a dignified man with salt-streaked hair and weary eyes that had seen too many close calls in business. Across the table, Zamir al-Rashid reviewed a thick stack of papers with an almost surgical calm. His legal advisor hovered at his shoulder, murmuring occasional clarifications in Arabic. Fariha studied Zamir discreetly. He wore a tailored charcoal suit, traditional guitar folded crisply on his shoulder in modern Gulf style. His cufflinks bore his family crest, a pair of interlocking falcons. Everything about him projected quiet command. She hated how intriguing she found him. How deeply her stomach coiled at the thought that this might be the man she would tie her life to, even temporarily. Zamir finally closed the folder, sliding it neatly in front of him. His dark eyes met hers directly, pinning her in place. "Miss Rahman, we both understand why we're here. The council charter that governs foreign equity is explicit. If I am not married by my 30th birthday 6 months from now, the protections over my family's holdings expire. The Altair Consortium stands ready to exploit that lapse. They've been circling like vultures for a year. His voice was even, measured, as if discussing market fluctuations rather than the dismemberment of a family legacy. Your father's pharmaceutical expansion is also facing hurdles with the new health ministry directives. Your recent lobbying efforts were impressive, but the ministry favors domestic alliances. A strategic marriage with my house all but guarantees your permits and ensures the charity wings you sponsor can continue uninterrupted. Her father cleared his throat, his relief at that unspoken promise obvious. But Fariha cut a sharp look toward Zamir, voice clipped. So this is just an exchange then? Your shares for our approvals, my hand in marriage as collateral. A flicker of something dark crossed Zamir's face. Annoyance? Or maybe a flash of guilt. It's not uncommon, in our part of the world or yours. Dynasties have always traded marriage for security. Is that what you told your last negotiations? She asked, voice dry. Zamir's mouth twitched at the corners, not quite a smile. Prince Zayn made his interest in you quite clear last year. Yet here you sit, negotiating with me instead of planning a royal wedding. She stiffened. Her nails dug into her palms beneath the table. That name was a ghost she didn't care to summon here, but it lingered between them now like a chill draft. Zayn's interest was political. His family wanted control over our production labs. My father declined, and the prince didn't take rejection gracefully. She didn't elaborate on the rumors Zayn had spread afterward, whispers meant to tarnish her reputation, to make her look unstable, cold, untrustworthy. She could still remember the biting humiliation at charity galas when older matrons looked at her as though she were a scandal waiting to erupt. Zamir studied her for a long moment, his gaze clinical, calculating. And yet there was something softer buried beneath, some glint of reluctant respect. So it seems we both require an arrangement that protects our families and keeps certain rival ambitions at bay. He flipped the contract open to the final page, sliding it toward her. His fingers were long, elegant, tipped with perfectly maintained nails. The hand of someone who had never done physical labor in his life but carried the weight of thousands. 12 months, he said quietly. At the end, a clean annulment. No demands, no complications. Your family's new facilities will be underwritten by our joint trust. My company retains its controlling protections against foreign acquisition. During the year, you will accompany me at necessary public functions, maintain the image of a stable union, and in private we will have complete discretion. No one else need intrude. So we live under the same roof. Play the happy couple, she said, her voice thin with distaste. Smile for the cameras. Give gossips something new to chew on. Exactly. His tone betrayed not the slightest pleasure at the idea. If anything, it sounded like he was assigning a tiresome chore. Why not Zayn? Her father cleared his throat again, sending her a warning glance. He was desperate. Their pharmaceutical expansion was already bleeding under hostile regulations, and a public alliance with Zamir's house would cement everything. Fariha, I know this isn't ideal, not ideal. Her laugh was brittle. Father, a year ago you were ready to sign me over to Zayn. His face reddened, shame and old fear warring there. Zayn turned out to be unstable. His overtures were laced with threats. You know how quickly that changed. Zamir's eyes sharpened on her. He hadn't known the extent, she realized. Good. Some things deserved to stay her private wounds. She drew a steadying breath. I will sign your contract, Mr. Al-Rashid, but I will do so under my own terms of dignity. I will not be a silent fixture at your side. My work continues, my women's education initiatives, my father's charity boards. I will not be stashed away behind palace walls. I would expect nothing less, Zamir replied coolly. It's precisely your visible independence that lends credibility to this alliance. Is that all I am to you? A symbol to parade before your board and foreign investors? Her question wasn't entirely rhetorical. She wanted to wound him, to see if there was anything soft under that flawless exterior. His eyes met hers without flinching, dark and unyielding. Yes, he said simply. That is precisely what you are to me. A necessary safeguard. The words cut more than any elaborate insult could have. She exhaled sharply, feeling suddenly foolish for probing for a sentiment she knew wouldn't be there. The contract signed, the legal advisor cleared his throat, indicating the final dotted line. Fariha picked up the pen. Her hand hovered for just a moment. Somewhere in the back of her mind was a vision of her mother's disappointed sighs, her old dreams of love matches and poetry. Then the pen met paper. Her signature flowed out in looping Urdu. Beside it, Zamir's already sat compact, angular, decisive. "There. We've sold ourselves for our families. Congratulations, Mr. Al-Rashid. May your empire stay intact. And may your father's factories continue to thrive," he replied dryly. "We've both bartered well." She stood abruptly, smoothing down her blouse, fixing him with a look that glittered with proud disdain. "Then let us both hope the next 12 months pass quickly." For the briefest second, his gaze dropped to her mouth. Something unreadable flickered across his features. Then it vanished, replaced by that same cool mask. Indeed. Leaving the room outside, the palace staff was already preparing for the announcement. Bouquets of rare flowers lined the hallways. Journalists would descend on them in days. Her wedding gown, ordered weeks ago through cautious negotiations, awaited final adjustments. As she walked beside her father down the long hallway of polished marble, she felt Zamir's footsteps echoing behind them. A steady shadow, a promise and a threat. She didn't look back. Zayn lingers in memory that night, alone in her suite overlooking the palace gardens. Fariha stood at the window, watching lanterns sway in the warm desert breeze. She thought of Zayn's last words to her, the sinister sweetness with which he promised she would regret refusing him. How he tried to corner her at the spring ball, his hand gripping her wrist hard enough to bruise. She could still feel the phantom imprint of his fingers. Whatever else Zamir might be, cold, calculating, transactional, he was at least not Zayn. Not the type to turn affection into violence. That was a mercy she hadn't expected to be grateful for. Zamir alone. Meanwhile, across the palace compound, Zamir sat in his private study, lights dim, files spread before him. His phone buzzed with messages from the board, from royal advisors, from distant cousins already maneuvering for more influence. He should have felt relief. The worst was averted. The contract was signed. His company's family's very name would survive. So why did his eyes keep drifting to the slim silver frame on his desk, the one that held a photo of his mother standing proudly beside the old souk where his grandfather first built their fortune? Why did he think of how disappointed she would have been to see him trading his marriage for stock protections? He scrubbed a hand across his face, exhaling shakily. 12 months, he murmured into the empty room. Then we're both free. But even he didn't quite believe it. The wedding was everything the tabloids promised it would be, a breathtaking spectacle of ancient tradition gilded by modern opulence. The palace courtyard was transformed into a midnight oasis. Silk canopies in deep sapphire and silver soared above the marble, anchored by carved columns wreathed in thousands of white jasmine and blush-pink roses. Glass lanterns hung at varying heights, their candlelight dancing across the crowd. Somewhere beyond the courtyard walls, the desert night lay vast and cool, the air heavy with unseen dunes waiting patiently under moonlight. Fariha stood just beyond one of the arches, her breath shallow against the delicate lace of her dupatta. It draped over her intricately embroidered bridal gown, a masterpiece of emerald and ivory threads that swept the floor behind her. Her hair was woven with tiny pearls, each glinting like a captured tear. "Breathe, Beta," her aunt whispered from beside her, fussing with the edge of the veil. "It will be over before you know it." That was what frightened her. That this was only the beginning of a carefully orchestrated performance that would consume her for the next 12 months. The wedding aisle. When the palace musicians struck up the traditional procession, the world seemed to compress into a narrow path. Servants stepped forward, sprinkling rose petals ahead of her. Guests, royalty, industrial magnates, foreign dignitaries all turned to watch, their faces masks of polite delight. But beneath every painted smile, she imagined their hungry curiosity. Would the contract bride falter? Would she betray some nervous tell? Fariha kept her chin high, eyes locked on the far end of the aisle where Zamir waited. His sherwani was midnight black, subtle threads of silver catching the lantern light. A ceremonial dagger lay at his side, a nod to old traditions. His guitar framed his sharp features, making him look even more severe, more untouchable. For a wild, humiliating heartbeat, she wished she could read even the slightest longing in his expression. Some flicker that this meant more to him than another item on a boardroom agenda. But his face was composed, eyes dark and unreadable, hands clasped loosely in front of him. Only when she drew close did she see a tiny tick in his jaw, the same one that betrayed him in their negotiations. Vows without warmth. The royal registrar read aloud the terms of their union, elegant phrases about family honor, mutual prosperity, the strength of two lineages joined together. Fariha repeated her vows with steady grace, her voice cool as the moon overhead. Zamir did the same, his low baritone devoid of tremor. When he reached for her hand to slip the wedding ring on, his fingers brushed hers lightly. A spark leapt up her arm, betraying her with a foolish hitch of breath. His eyes darted to hers, something almost startled passing through them, before his mouth firmed into a thin line. Cheers rose around them as they completed the ritual binding. Golden confetti showered them, caught in the delicate embroidery of her dupatta. Somewhere nearby, photographers jostled for angles. Their families pressed close, murmuring congratulations, their fathers clasping hands with the smug satisfaction of men who had brokered a flawless deal. "Smile," Zamir murmured under his breath, his mouth barely moving. His hand tightened fractionally on hers. "They're watching." So she did. A brilliant smile that hurt her cheeks, aimed at cameras she couldn't wait to be free of. The kingdom's most circulated papers would print this moment tomorrow, the contract newlyweds, flawless and glittering. A promise of stability in a volatile market. Only she and Zamir knew the truth. The first dance as evening deepened, the courtyard transformed into a ballroom under the stars. Musicians shifted from stately hymns to more playful strings. Couples took to the polished marble floor, swirling in flowing abayas and dark tailored suits. When it came time for the bride and groom's first dance, Fariha felt her stomach knot. Zamir's hand at her waist was careful, impersonal. His other clasped hers in a grip that felt like restraint rather than intimacy. "Relax," he murmured, voice so low she felt it against her collarbone more than heard it. "You're trembling." "Do I have reason not to be?" she whispered back. His eyes met hers, hard and searching. "You're safe here." The words were unexpected. For a breathless moment she couldn't speak. Not safe with him emotionally, that was already lost. But physically, from scandal, from other men who might have tried to use her family's desperation, yes. Perhaps in that narrow sense, she was safer than she would have been in Zayn's arms. "Just keep smiling," he added, voice dropping to a husky edge. "Another few hours and we're free of this spectacle." Watching eyes as they moved across the marble, she caught sight of Prince Zayn lingering at the edge of the crowd. His lean figure draped in deep teal robes, a sardonic smile playing on his lips. He raised a glass slightly when her gaze met his, a silent, taunting toast. Her pulse jumped. Reflexively she shifted closer to Zamir, who stiffened at her sudden nearness. "Is it Zayn?" he asked, his tone turning clipped. "It doesn't matter. It matters if he tries to approach you tonight. He won't. He knows the cameras are everywhere." Her voice was calm, though her heart battered painfully. Zamir's hand pressed a fraction more firmly at her waist. A subtle claim. They danced on, a beautiful lie beneath a sky crowded with stars. The wedding night, their suite was part of the royal family's east wing, a set of gilded chambers older than most countries, with ceilings painted in swirling scenes of battles and triumphs. Moonlight spilled across the marble floors, catching on silver inlays that seemed to shimmer like water. Fariha stood by the bed, her palms pressed against the cool post. Her maids had finally left after helping her out of the heavy bridal gown and into a simpler silk robe. Her hair tumbled in loose waves down her back, the pearl pins all removed. Behind her, Zamir loosened his Sherwani collar, his movements tense. The silence stretched unbearably. "You needn't worry," he said finally. His voice was oddly rough, as though scraped by stones. "The contract requires appearances, not consummation. I'll take the adjoining room." It was merciful, painfully so, because some traitorous part of her had half-wished for anything that might bridge this impossible distance. Even anger, even reckless passion, would have felt more real than this cold decorum. "Thank you," she said, her voice coming out smaller than she intended. He paused at the threshold to the side chamber, his silhouette limned in moonlight. For a heartbeat, it looked like he might turn back. Like he might cross the distance, brush a hand against her cheek, whisper something reckless and human. But he only nodded once. "Good night, Fariha." "Good night, Zamir." And then he was gone, the carved door clicking shut behind him. The echo seemed to ripple through her bones. Alone with thoughts, she crawled into the enormous bed, pulling the silk sheets up to her chin though the night was warm. Her eyes stung, but she refused to cry. Outside, fountains burbled in the courtyard, their gentle splash mocking her restless mind. Somewhere in the deeper gardens, peacocks called to each other, haunting notes that sounded almost like weeping. She tried to imagine 12 months passing swiftly, a clean annulment, her family secure, her father's debts manageable, her own dignity intact. Then freedom. She could return to her clinics, her charity schools, her quiet life without palaces and ruthless negotiations. But she couldn't quite banish the memory of Zamir's hand steady on her waist during the dance. Or the haunted shadow in his eyes when he said, "You're safe here." Zamir alone in the adjoining suite, Zamir stood at the window overlooking the inner courtyard. His wedding ring felt heavy on his finger, a band of responsibility that pressed like a shackle. He told himself this was the smartest play. A contract. A safeguard. Nothing more. Yet all evening he'd found his gaze drawn to Fariha, the graceful line of her throat, the stubborn pride that sharpened her features when courtiers fawned too eagerly. She was nothing like the vapid heiresses his board once paraded before him. She was sharper, more complicated, dangerous, because he could feel the subtle hooks of her presence catching on something inside him he'd long thought dead. 12 months. Just 12 months. Then they could both be free. Weeks passed like a procession of careful steps. Each day brought new obligations: ribbon cuttings at hospitals, economic summits, quiet dinners with foreign ambassadors where every smile was calculated. Fariha found herself growing accustomed to the performance. She learned exactly how to tilt her head when photographers called her name, how to let her hand rest on Zamir's arm as though they were bound by more than contract. They became a flawless tableau of power and unity. Sometimes she caught herself almost admiring how seamlessly they moved together, how they could trade a glance across a crowded room and know precisely when to lean in close for a staged whisper. It was dizzying how easily deception could start to feel like instinct. But the nights always ended the same way: doors closing quietly, two separate rooms, the silence echoing louder than any crowd. The charity gala tonight was one of the season's crowning events, a lavish gala to fundraise for new maternal health clinics. It was precisely the kind of cause Fariha championed, and precisely the kind of public arena Zamir used to steady the market's confidence. The ballroom glittered under immense crystal chandeliers. Waiters in ivory livery carried trays of delicate confections and glasses of pale gold champagne. Ornate floral installations spiraled up marble columns, orchids and hydrangeas interwoven with silver strands. A live quartet played near a grand fountain, notes of violin and harp threading through the warm air. Fariha wore a flowing silver gown embroidered with tiny crystals that caught every flicker of light. Her hair was pinned elegantly, revealing a delicate diamond pendant at her throat, a gift from Zamir's mother, who'd insisted she wear something from the family vaults. Zamir was at her side in a midnight suit, his cufflinks bearing the same twin falcons she now recognized from dozens of family crests. His hand rested lightly at her back as they greeted donors and dignitaries, their smiles immaculate, their laughter measured. "Eurovision tonight," he murmured at one point, so softly she nearly missed it. She blinked up at him, startled. It was the first compliment he'd offered that wasn't about how well she'd handled an investor or outmaneuvered a rumor. "Thank you," she said, heart betraying her by fluttering. That almost sounded sincere. A ghost of a smile tugged at his lips. "Don't get used to it." Prince Zayn arrives. They had nearly completed their obligatory circuit of the ballroom when a subtle ripple passed through the crowd. Fariha's spine went rigid. Zamir noticed instantly. "What is it?" Before she could answer, a familiar voice slid through the din. "Lady Fariha, Alhamdulillah, the kingdom shines a little brighter tonight with your presence." Prince Zayn appeared from a cluster of minor royals. His robe was a luxurious teal threaded with gold, his dark hair tied back at the nape. His smile was perfectly shaped, his eyes gleaming with the practiced charm of someone who enjoyed watching people squirm. Fariha dipped her head in cool greeting. "Your Highness. It's been some time. Far too long." Zayn's gaze slid over her with unhurried possession before drifting to Zamir. "Ah, the dutiful husband. You must be very proud. The entire kingdom is talking about how luminous she looks." Zamir's hand tightened imperceptibly at her waist. "Thank you. We find it best to let our actions speak louder than gossip." "Actions, yes," Zayn mused, swirling the champagne in his glass. "Though sometimes gossip has more poetry. They say you two are inseparable, that there's a love story brewing behind these diplomatic unions." "Then they're more imaginative than most analysts," Zamir said, voice turning flat. Zayn's smile widened. "May I borrow your wife for a dance? For old time's sake. Unless of course your arrangements forbid it." The dance with Zayn. Fariha's breath caught. Her instinct was to refuse, but the nearest journalists had already turned curious eyes their way. A scandal over a refused dance would ignite precisely the wrong sort of headlines. She felt Zamir's tension beside her, the storm gathering in the subtle angle of his jaw. "One dance," she said, carefully. "Then I must return to my husband's side." Zamir's eyes flashed, but he gave a short nod. Zayn led her out onto the marble floor, his hand too familiar at her waist, his touch lingering where Zamir's had always been restrained. As the quartet began a delicate waltz, he leaned in, his breath warm against her ear. "I was surprised when you chose him over me. I offered you a throne, Fariha." A future with no shortages of power, no threats to your precious charities. You offered me ownership, not partnership, she said sharply. And what has he offered you? A cold bed? The promise of freedom in 12 months? You're smarter than this, darling. Surely you see how easily he could extend the contract, tie you up indefinitely. Her steps faltered for just a beat. That fear that this arrangement might somehow snare her longer than intended had haunted her in darker moments. You forget yourself, she whispered. I am his wife. However it began, our agreement is our business. I will not have it dissected by you. Ziyan's grip tightened. And if I say you still belong with me? That this should have been our night, our kingdom to shape together. Before she could wrench away, a shadow fell across them. Zamir stood there, tall and imposing, his eyes twin shards of winter. My turn, he said quietly, extending his hand to Fariha. Zayan's lips curled. How gallant. She's all yours for now. Zamir's jealousy cracks. Fariha all but stumbled into Zamir's arms, her breath coming quick. As they began to move, she realized his hand at her waist was not gentle tonight, it was possessive, his fingers splayed wide, pulling her flush against him. Was it necessary to make a scene, she murmured, trying to mask how wildly her heart pounded. You looked uncomfortable. I decided that was more important than protocol. She studied his face, the rigid set of his mouth, the faint flush at his throat. You were jealous. His gaze snapped to hers. Don't be absurd. Then why do you look like you're contemplating murder? A muscle jumped in his cheek. Because I don't trust him. And because. He broke off, jaw tightening. Because what, she pressed, breathless. Because you're my wife, he ground out, so low only she could hear. And for tonight at least, I'd like to keep the illusion intact. Even for myself. A dance that feels like more. They circled the ballroom, the music swelling, drowning out the voices around them. His hand slid slightly higher on her back, her own fingers tightening on his shoulder. It felt dangerously like something more than duty, like a spark that might burn if they weren't careful. When the music ended, neither of them moved at first. They stood there, her pulse racing, his breath hot against her temple. Finally he pulled back, his eyes searching hers with a raw vulnerability she hadn't seen before. Are you alright, he asked hoarsely. Yes, she managed, though she wasn't sure it was true. After the gala hours later, the gala wound down. Back in their suite, Fariha stood at her dressing table, removing earrings that felt suddenly too heavy. In the mirror, she saw Zamir lingering near the doorway, watching her. What is it, she asked, her voice softer than she meant. He hesitated, then crossed the room to stand behind her. For a heartbeat she thought he might touch her reflection, press his hand to her shoulder. But he only looked at her in the glass, eyes dark with something she couldn't quite name. Thank you, he said roughly. For tonight. For handling Zayan. For everything. Her heart gave a painful little twist. This is what we agreed to. I play the part. You keep your empire. We both get our freedom. Right, he said, as if trying to convince himself. But neither of them moved for a long moment, suspended in the fragile quiet. Then he turned abruptly and left for his adjoining room, the door clicking softly behind him. Sparkles. End of chapter 4. Outside the palace windows, the garden fountains glittered in moonlight. Somewhere beyond the high walls, the kingdom still whispered about them, the contract couple who seemed too flawless to be real. Inside, two hearts lay restless, each haunted by the terrifying suspicion that maybe this arrangement had already tangled deeper than they ever intended. Days passed since the charity gala, each one threading more tightly around the fragile, glittering web they had spun together. Fariha had almost started believing they could continue like this indefinitely, poised smiles at diplomatic brunches, polite silences at home, separate rooms ensuring nothing ever slipped past the boundaries of their agreement. Then the polo accident changed everything. An unexpected return. It was a warm afternoon, sunlight pooling golden across the palace's inner courtyard. Fariha was at her writing desk, drafting proposals for her women's health initiative, her favorite refuge when palace life felt suffocating. The door burst open without warning. One of Zamir's aides hurried in, bowing sharply. My lady, apologies, but His Excellency had a minor fall at today's charity polo match. The team physician checked him, but he refused to rest at the clubhouse. Insisted on returning home. Fariha's pen clattered to the floor. Is he badly hurt? No fractures, madam. A deep bruise on the shoulder and a gash on his arm. He's in a rather foul mood. She didn't wait for more. Gathering her skirts, she swept past the aide, her heart hammering with a mix of dread and something alarmingly like concern. Seeing him hurt, she found Zamir in his private lounge, an airy room with carved screens that let in patterns of dancing light. He stood near the divan, one arm out of his riding jacket, the white sleeve beneath streaked with blood. "You stubborn, pride-soaked," she began, then bit it back. Her voice came out strangled. "Why didn't you stay at the medical tent?" "Because the photographers were circling like jackals," he muttered. His dark hair was damp with sweat, a strand fallen across his forehead. "I'm not about to give them a field day speculating about my health. The last thing we need is a rumor that I'm too weak to manage my own company." She approached slowly, trying to mask how unsteady her legs felt. "Sit down before you fall down." He shot her a glare that was more weary than sharp, but he obeyed, lowering himself onto the divan with a tight hiss. Tending to his wound, the palace nurse arrived with fresh bandages and antiseptic, bowing and retreating again when Fariha dismissed her with a quiet command. "I'll do it." Zamir watched her warily as she dipped a cloth into the antiseptic, wringing it out with careful fingers. When she began cleaning the gash along his upper arm, he sucked in a sharp breath. "Try to hold still," she murmured, her voice instinctively gentle. "Hard to do when you're pouring acid on an open wound," he muttered through clenched teeth. She risked a tiny smile. "It's not acid, though I admit, I'm tempted." "Charming." But then he went silent, his eyes shuttered. Fariha felt her anger drain away, replaced by a strange, tender ache. Up close, she could see the faint lines of exhaustion at the corners of his mouth, the way his hand gripped the edge of the divan so tightly his knuckles blanched. When she smoothed the gauze over the cleaned wound, her fingers brushed his skin. He flinched not from pain, but something else. His gaze locked on hers, startlingly open for just a breath. "Thank you," he said roughly. "For what? Treating you like a recalcitrant child?" She meant it to sound teasing, but her voice came out too soft. "For caring, even if you pretend you don't." A moment that lingers. Fariha tied off the bandage, her hands trembling slightly. She sat back on her heels, suddenly aware of how close they were, how the faint scent of his cologne oozed and something sharper enveloped her. "Don't mistake this for more than it is," she managed. "We have 12 months. I'm keeping us intact because your empire protects my father's clinics. That's all." He studied her face, eyes dark and unreadable. "If you say so." The words hung heavy, as though he didn't quite believe them. Neither, in truth, did she. The storm outside later that evening, a sudden desert storm rolled in, slamming warm rain against the palace windows. Thunder cracked over the minarets, echoing through cavernous halls. Fariha couldn't sleep. Her thoughts churned with the memory of Zamir's pained wince, the way his breath stuttered when she pressed the bandage in place. Against her better judgment, she rose and padded quietly to the adjoining door. She found him in bed, propped on one elbow, reading a stack of economic briefs. The bandage peeked stark white against his tanned skin. "Can't sleep?" he asked without looking up. "Neither can you, apparently." He set the papers aside. The storm rumbled again, and for a moment the distant lightning illuminated the tired lines of his face. He didn't look like the icy strategist the board feared. He looked like a man shouldering more than he could ever speak aloud. Fariha crossed the threshold before she could stop herself. She perched on the edge of his bed, twisting her hands in her lap. "I know we agreed on distance. But if you're in pain, or if you need, it's just bruises, Fariha. They'll heal." "Not all bruises heal easily," she whispered. His eyes snapped to hers, startled. For a breathless second, she thought he might reach for her. That he might pull her down beside him, let them both pretend there was something tender between them beyond the cold arithmetic of duty. But he only exhaled shakily. "Get some sleep," he said, voice husky. "The storm will pass." She rose slowly, disappointment stinging like salt. "Good night, Zamir." "Good night, Fariha." A quiet confession hours later, the storm still murmured through the palace. Fariha lay awake in her bed, staring at the ceiling. Just when she thought sleep might finally come, she heard the softest sound, her adjoining door clicking open. Zamir stood there in the dim light, barefoot, one hand braced against the frame. "I couldn't sleep," he confessed, voice rough with embarrassment. "The bandage pulled. And maybe I didn't want to be alone." Her heart cracked painfully. She lifted the covers without a word. He crossed the room, moving carefully, and settled beside her. They lay on their backs, inches apart, not touching. The space between them pulsed like something alive. After a long moment, he turned his head slightly. "Thank you. For earlier. And for this." She didn't trust her voice, so she only nodded. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he shifted closer until his shoulder brushed hers. They stayed like that, two battered hearts resting in fragile proximity, while the storm washed over the palace. Neither asleep, neither speaking, but for once not quite alone. Outside, the rain finally slowed, leaving the gardens drenched and glistening under hesitant starlight. Inside, behind locked doors, a husband and wife lay side by side, still contract-bound, still pretending, yet more entwined than either dared admit. The palace had never felt so crowded. It was the night of the annual Crown Development Summit, a glittering affair meant to reassure the international press and show the kingdom's stable partnerships. Representatives from Gulf states, Europe, and beyond filled the vast golden hall, their conversations humming under vaulted ceilings painted with hunting scenes and soaring falcons. Fariha stood at Zamir's side, her hand lightly tucked into the crook of his arm. Her gown tonight was a deep garnet that shimmered like embers each time she moved. Her hair was swept into an intricate knot, held by a thin circlet of rubies. On the surface, she was the perfect portrait of a diplomatic wife, elegant, composed, smiling graciously at small jokes from visiting ministers. Inside, her mind churned. Watching Zamir unravel. Zamir had been unusually tense all evening. His injured shoulder, though healing, still clearly troubled him. She saw it in the slight hesitation whenever he reached for a glass or offered a handshake. More worrying were the looks exchanged by certain board members from the Al Marwan faction. They were sharks circling blood. Fariha caught snippets of conversation as they passed. If Rashid's health truly flags, the protections lapse, do they not? A clause in the shareholder covenant. His wife's pretty enough to parade, but charm doesn't secure quarterly targets. And there's that old rumor his father lost half the family fortune once. What if it runs in the blood? The words cut through her composure, sharp as a whetted blade. A political strike. They were seated for the formal dinner when the real strike came. The finance minister from a neighboring country raised his glass with a sleek smile. We all admire the fortitude of House Al Rashid, but surely it's fair to question, is your family prepared for the strain of these new joint ventures? Especially with whispers about your health complications, Zamir. The room fell into a hush. Even the string quartet paused, an awkward break in their lilting tune. Fariha felt Zamir stiffen beside her. His jaw worked, but before he could speak, she laid her hand over his, her heart thundering. It's interesting you bring that up, Your Excellency, she said, her voice like calm poured over ice. Because I recall your delegation asking last year if we would guarantee certain commodity prices despite global downturns. Zamir refused on principle. Because unlike some, he doesn't gamble with people's livelihoods for quick applause. The minister blinked, momentarily thrown. She pressed on. Health rumors are convenient distractions from poor policy proposals. But my husband has proven time and again that he stands for strategic growth. Not flattery, not theatrics. Then she smiled sweetly. Surely that's the leadership your investors prefer. A ripple of approving murmurs rose around the table. Even the critical board members looked mildly impressed. After the dinner, when they returned to their private wing hours later, the tension was finally broken. Zamir set down his cufflinks on the polished dresser with unsteady fingers. You didn't have to do that, he murmured. Yes, I did. Fariha unfastened her earrings slowly, not meeting his gaze. I won't have them slicing you apart like you're some weak link they can buy out at the first whiff of trouble. Silence stretched between them, full of things neither had yet dared say. Then he stepped closer, reaching out. His hand hovered near her shoulder, as though seeking permission. I should have defended myself. It's not your job to be my shield. Maybe not, she whispered, but maybe I wanted to be. Just this once. A crack in the armor, his breath shuddered out. Gently, he cupped her cheek, thumb grazing the delicate skin beneath her eye. The contact was feather-light, almost reverent. You keep doing that, he said, voice raw. Doing what? Breaking rules we set. Making this contract feel like something else. Her pulse stuttered. Is that so terrible? He didn't answer in words. Instead, he leaned down and pressed his forehead to hers. Their noses brushed, breath mingling. She felt his hesitation and the tiny tremor of his hand at her waist, in the way his body nearly sagged into hers, exhausted not just from politics, but from holding himself at such relentless distance. Fariha, he whispered. Just her name, but said like it cost him everything. Her hands fisted lightly in the fabric of his jacket. For a long heartbeat, they simply stood there, connected in fragile silence. Then he pulled back. I stormed arc. Not yet, he breathed. If we blur these lines now, I don't know how we'll ever walk them again. It felt like a promise and a curse all at once. A vulnerable night that night, he didn't retreat to his adjoining chamber. Instead, he lay beside her in the vast bed, fully clothed, their bodies separated by a careful inch that throbbed like a wound. Rain fell outside, gentle this time, whispering against the carved balcony doors. She thought he had fallen asleep when his voice came low in the dark. You know, my mother once told me marriage should be like water taking the shape of whatever vessel life pours it into. I always thought it was foolish. That control was better than flexibility. That planning was stronger than faith. She turned toward him. Even in the dim lamplight, she could see the unguarded weariness in his eyes. And now she asked. Now I don't know. Maybe water was always the stronger thing. She reached for his hand under the covers, threading her fingers through his. Neither spoke again, but in the hush of their shared breath, with their palms warm together, something began to shift. Not enough to call it love, not yet, but enough to know that when the time came to end this contract, it might break them both more than they ever planned. Or even their first painful near confession, where one tries to say don't go when the year ends. It began with a whisper. A tiny article buried on page 3 of a minor financial journal. A single trembling leaf on an otherwise still pond. But by the end of the week, it had become a tempest. Headlines screamed across glossy front pages and buzzing news tickers. Al Rashid's wife under scrutiny, misappropriation of clinic funds. Charity scandal. Is Zamir Al Rashid's empire built on his wife's lies? Fariha stood frozen in the palace's private media room, screens glaring back at her with vicious certainty. Photos of her smiling at opening ceremonies, hugging malnourished children, laying the first bricks of maternity wards, all paired with slanted captions that made her stomach churn. Is her compassion merely a clever smokescreen? The first confrontation she didn't hear Zamir enter until his reflection appeared beside hers on the giant wall screen. His expression was a study in icy fury. Turn it off, he commanded the aide by the door. The screens went dark instantly, leaving only the two of them and the hush of a shocked household. Fariha swallowed, hands twisting together. I don't understand. These clinics have immaculate records. The auditors, this isn't about truth. His voice was low and controlled, a dangerous softness. It's about leverage. Someone wants to weaken my position before next quarter's shareholder summit. She shook her head. But it's my reputation they're shredding. My life's work. Then they've miscalculated. His eyes burned into hers. Because by attacking you, they've given me every reason to crush them. Personally. Doubts in the quiet, but when the door closed behind his departing aides, that powerful shield dropped. Fariha sank onto one of the long velvet benches, burying her face in her hands. What if people stop donating? What if mothers can't bring their children because of this filth? It took years to build trust. And now she felt the cushion shift under Zamir's weight. Then his hand was at the back of her neck, warm, firm. Not demanding, just anchoring her there. Look at me. Slowly, she lifted her tear-wet face. I will not let them destroy you. Or your clinics. They'll have to crawl over my corpse. Something inside her cracked at the raw ferocity of it. But it isn't your battle, isn't it? His thumb traced a slow line just below her jaw. You are my wife. Do you truly still think that means nothing to me? Her heart tripped painfully. She wanted to ask, then what does it mean to you? But the words tangled in her throat, heavy with hope she was too afraid to name. Facing the public storm the next evening, they attended a hastily arranged press conference. The grand hall was packed, lights blazing, cameras humming, journalists crowding close. Fariha wore a modest ivory dress that made her look almost fragile under the onslaught of flashbulbs. But her eyes were bright, her spine straight as an arrow. Zamir stood at her side, one hand firmly at her back, his presence radiating a silent threat to anyone who might overstep. My wife's clinics have saved thousands of lives, he told the room, voice ringing with cold authority. Every rial donated is accounted for. In fact, the Ministry of Health will release a full independent audit within 48 hours. A reporter tried to cut in. Sir, what if enough? Zamir's voice snapped like a whip. I will not have her name or the countless women and children she has lifted out of despair tarnished by political vultures. Then, stunning everyone, he turned slightly and threaded his fingers through Fariha's, raising their joined hands for the cameras. It was a move of ownership but also of solidarity. His thumb brushed hers once, the tiniest promise hidden inside the public gesture. We stand together. If anyone wishes to challenge that, they may try. They will fail. The cameras went mad, bulbs exploding in rapid succession. And for the first time in days, Fariha allowed herself to breathe. A fragile private moment much later, back in their chambers, the adrenaline faded, leaving only raw edges. Fariha sank onto the edge of the bed, shoulders drooping. Zamir stood across from her, pulling off his cufflinks with jerky motions. You shouldn't have to endure this filth. I brought you into my world thinking I could protect you from it, that if we kept this marriage transactional, you'd stay untouched by its ugliness. She looked up sharply. And you think it would have been kinder to watch from afar? To let them shred me without even the power of your name behind mine? Maybe it would have spared you this. He dropped the cufflinks onto the dresser. They landed with a harsh metallic clink. I don't know anymore. Because every time they come for you, I feel like they're slicing pieces off me. Nearly crossing the line, silence stretched, heavy and humming. Then she rose and crossed to him, hesitating only a heartbeat before placing her palm against his chest. You said once that this was just water taking the shape of whatever vessel life gave it. Maybe we don't have to define it at all right now. His breath shuddered. One of his hands came up, cradling her wrist, not pulling it away. Fariha, he whispered. Her name was almost broken, like a confession. She leaned in, just enough that her forehead brushed his. They stood like that, so close she could feel the frantic pace of his heart, until finally he pressed the gentlest kiss to her hair. Not yet, he murmured, though his grip on her tightened, contradicting his own words. If I lose you to this contract, if I ruin you the way I ruin everything I touch, I don't think I'll recover. Then don't let yourself ruin it, she whispered back. And though neither said it outright, some unspoken vow curled between them, fragile and new. Outside, the storm of cameras and speculation still raged. But inside this dimly lit room, their hands remained intertwined, two weary souls clinging to the only certainty left each other. For a blissful moment, it almost seemed the worst had passed. The audit reports landed clean, thorough, damning every whisper of corruption as baseless. Donations to Fariha's clinics surged in a wave of defiance against the smear campaign. Even the sharp-tongued society columnists wrote breathless pieces about how she'd emerged stronger, her husband unwavering by her side. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting for the ground to crumble. Zayan's cruel seed. The next tremor came not from the press, but from Prince Zayan himself. He cornered Fariha at a luncheon hosted by the health minister, all charm and silk. Slipping into the seat beside hers, he ignored the wary glance she shot him. Congratulations, he said lightly, slicing into a pastry. Surviving your first real public assassination attempt. You should be proud. Save your poison. We're not children at court anymore, playing with rumors like toys. Oh, I know. We're playing for kingdoms now. His smile turned razor sharp. Tell me, Fariha, what happens when the year is up? Her fork stilled. What? The contract. It was 12 months, yes? Zamir regains control over fragile foreign investments by proving he's stable and married. You shield your father's foundations with the might of the Al-Rashids. But after that, who protects you? I can protect myself. Ah, of course. The elegant warrior queen. He leaned in, voice dropping. But don't you ever wonder if he's planning to quietly extend the contract? Or worse, tear it up the moment he's legally clear, cast you off so he can pursue a match with real political heft? There are murmurs he's already entertaining foreign royal alliances. Her throat closed painfully. Stop. I'd hate to see your pretty heart broken when the inevitable comes. That's all. The fight erupts that evening, her heart still knotted with Zayan's insinuations. Fariha found Zamir in his private study, papers scattered around him. You're home early, he said, eyes flicking up, concern touching his face. You look pale. Were you ever going to tell me? She blurted. He frowned. Tell you what? About extending the contract. Or voiding it. Or finding a more strategically valuable wife once your market guarantees are cemented. His face turned to stone. Where did you hear that? Does it matter? Her voice rose, cracking. Is it true? No, the single word was low, lethal. And it matters because someone is feeding you lies to undermine us. Is it so impossible to imagine? You married me for convenience. I married you for protection. All we've done since is pretend. Why wouldn't you secure something purer for your legacy when the opportunity arises? Zamir surged to his feet so quickly papers flew from the desk. Don't you dare reduce this to pretend. Not after everything. What exactly is it, then? Her hands curled into fists. Because I'm tired, Zamir. Tired of feeling like we're building a house out of smoke, and the moment I breathe too deeply, it'll vanish. Tearing each other open, he strode forward, stopping only when they were nearly chest to chest. His hands hovered at her arms but didn't touch, as though terrified he'd break her if he did. You think I'd parade you in front of half the world, defend you like a madman in press conferences, bleed for your damned clinics if I planned to discard you? You might if it kept your board from tearing you apart. If it kept your empire intact. And what about you, Fariha? His voice cracked. You speak of legacy, would you have stayed if my stock had tanked? If marrying me cost your father's foundations every dollar of their future? Her breath caught. That's not fair. No, it's true. We both stepped into this for survival. But somewhere along the way, I started to. He stopped, visibly grappling for control. I don't even know what this is anymore. Only that the thought of it ending terrifies me more than bankruptcy ever could. The dangerous admission she couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, only stared at him, her heart shattering at the raw vulnerability in his eyes. Zamir, I don't know how to do this with you, he confessed hoarsely. I spent my life building walls no one could scale. You tore through them without even trying. His hand finally touched her face, cupping her cheek with a tenderness that threatened to undo her completely. But if you keep doubting me, if you let vipers like Zayan plant poison in your head, I swear it will destroy us before we ever figure out what we could have been. Pulling away, her eyes blurred with tears. I'm scared. Don't you understand that? I'm scared you'll wake up one day and remember this was only meant to be 12 months. That you'll look at me and see nothing but an inconvenient attachment. And I'm scared you'll walk away when you realize how deeply I've already fallen, he rasped. The words hung between them, horrifying and beautiful. Then, abruptly, he stepped back, hands dropping to his sides like lead. I can't do this tonight. He turned and left, the heavy door slamming shut behind him. The echo rattled through her bones. Alone with her fears, she stood there in the cavernous silence, shaking. All the glittering chandeliers, the priceless rugs, the carved teak doors, none of it mattered if he wasn't beside her. She sank to the floor, pulling her knees to her chest. And for the first time since this marriage began, she sobbed, not from fear of losing her clinics or her father's security, but from the unbearable thought of losing him. Outside, the kingdom carried on, indifferent to the wreckage inside palace walls. But within these chambers, a husband and wife were learning that the most dangerous storms came not from scandal or politics, but from the fragile, terrifying thing growing in the quiet between two hearts. The palace never felt so large or so empty. Fariha spent 3 days tiptoeing around its gilded halls, trying to keep her mind occupied with charitable correspondences and clinic budgets. Anything to avoid that raw memory of Zamir's eyes, how they'd cracked open with terrified confession before he fled. He didn't join her for breakfast, didn't drift into her library with a quiet question about her day. At night, his adjoining door stayed closed, the thin sliver of light beneath it as cold as the rest of the marble floors. Plans to leave on the 4th morning, she found herself packing. Not dramatically, not with suitcases heaped at the door. Just quietly folding gowns into a trunk, telling herself it was only a precaution. I can go stay at the Western Villa. Only until things calm down. Give us both space. But as she smoothed a delicate cashmere wrap into place, tears blurred her vision. Because she knew leaving wouldn't calm anything. It would shatter what fragile thread still tied them together. The confrontation, she didn't hear him come in, only felt a sudden shift in the air, the way her skin prickled before his voice cut through the quiet. Are you running from me, Fariha? She spun around, heart hammering. Zamir stood in the doorway, disheveled from a long day at the board, tie gone, shirt cuffs undone, eyes rimmed red like he hadn't slept in days. I wasn't, don't lie to me. Her throat worked painfully. I thought it might be simpler if I stepped back. For a while. Simpler for who? His voice broke, something tortured flashing across his face. For you or for me? Pouring everything out, she dropped her hands helplessly. This was never supposed to matter this much. We were meant to be partners on paper. We kept telling ourselves that so it wouldn't hurt when it ended. Then why does it feel like I can't breathe knowing you were about to walk out that door? He choked. Before she could answer, he was crossing the room in 2 furious strides. His hands caught her shoulders, not harsh, but desperate, as if anchoring her there was the only way he'd survive. I don't care what this was meant to be. I only know what it is now. And I'm tired of pretending. Her pulse thundered. Zamir, I love you. It was so abrupt, so raw, she actually gasped. His hands tightened on her, his forehead dropping to hers. Do you hear me? I love you. I was halfway in love with you before we even signed that damned contract, watching you stand up to my board with fire in your eyes. I thought I could keep it controlled. Temporary, but every day with you ruined that plan. Her tears spilled over. You idiot, she whispered, half laughing, half sobbing. I've been so scared. Because I love you too. And it felt like the most foolish, dangerous thing in the world. The moment they break, his breath stuttered. Then he was kissing her, not careful or practiced, but devastatingly honest. His hands cradled her face as if afraid she'd vanish. She clung to him just as fiercely, months of locked-up longing crashing down between them. When he finally pulled back, they were both shaking. "No more contracts," he rasped. "No more countdowns. What if it all still falls apart? Then we'll rebuild it. Together." A vow beyond paper. They ended up curled on the edge of her bed, her head on his shoulder, his thumb tracing lazy patterns over her wrist. "Marry me again," he whispered suddenly. She blinked up at him. "We already are." "No. Not for shares or your father's protection or my damned empire. Marry me because we're in love. Because I'm terrified of living in a world where I don't get to hold you like this." Her smile was tremulous, but dazzling. "Then ask me properly." He cupped her cheek, eyes dark and achingly soft. "Fariha el-Rashid, will you stay my wife without contracts, without finish lines, only us for as long as you'll have me?" Her laugh broke into a tearful sob. "Yes. Of course, yes." Outside, the city continued its indifferent rush, markets bustling, clerks tallying figures, ministers plotting their next moves. But inside these ancient palace walls, two people who once thought love was a liability found it was the strongest claim they'd ever make. The day dawned brilliant and blue, the kind of sky that seemed to stretch forever, as if even the heavens were witness to what this day meant. Fariha stood before an ornately carved mirror in her private chambers, breath-catching as her attendants finished securing the final touches of her gown. Unlike her first wedding dress, which had been a quiet affair of ivory silk and nervous duty, this one was a masterpiece of shimmering midnight blue. Tiny sapphires and seed pearls had been stitched into intricate vines across the bodice, twining down her sleeves as if to wrap her in living starlight. "A different bride, you look like a story the moon would tell," whispered Amina, her childhood friend who now managed much of the palace household. Fariha smiled tremulously. "Do I look terrified?" "No." Amina squeezed her hands. "You look like a woman finally marrying for herself." That truth settled deep in her chest, warm and buoyant. This time there were no silent bargains behind her eyes, no ledger of debts and duties. Today was purely, fiercely theirs. Seeing him again when the palace bells began to toll, Fariha felt her stomach drop in that delicious, swooping way that only ever seemed to happen with Zamir. She stepped through the carved doors into the open-air courtyard transformed by hundreds of pale lanterns and thousands of delicate white roses. Guests filled every seat, nobles and ministers mingling with ambassadors from across the Gulf and beyond. But all she truly saw was him. Zamir stood waiting at the end of the aisle, clad in traditional deep gray robes edged with silver thread. A ceremonial dagger rested at his waist, its hilt set with opals. But it was his eyes that undid her, dark, unwavering, raw with emotion he no longer bothered to hide. When she reached him, he took her hands openly, possessively. No careful distance this time. His thumb ran over her knuckles like he was memorizing the shape of forever. The vow they chose, there was no elaborate recitation of conditions. No lawyers hovering with papers to sign. Only the elderly royal imam, whose smile crinkled all the way to his eyes. "Zamir ibn Rashid," he intoned, "and Fariha bint Rashid, you stand before God, before your people, and before your own trembling hearts. Do you enter this union without coercion, not for empire nor security but from love alone?" "I do," Zamir said, voice steady. Then he turned to Fariha, his hands tightening around hers. "I do, because every day I am more certain I was born to love you." Her breath caught on a sob that was half joy, half relief. "And I do," she whispered, blinking rapidly against tears. "Because this is no longer survival. It's home." The world sees them now when they were declared husband and wife again, but for real this time. The courtyard erupted into applause. Doves released from gilded cages swept upward in a flurry of pale wings. A string ensemble began to play a soaring melody that felt like it might lift her right off the earth. Fariha didn't wait for protocol. She rose onto her toes and kissed Zamir first, her hands framing his face. The crowd gasped in delighted shock. No one had expected the shy queen of the clinics to be the one to make the bold move. Zamir let out a soft, almost disbelieving laugh against her mouth, before deepening the kiss with an intensity that left her dizzy. When they finally pulled apart, his forehead rested against hers. "I'm not letting you go. Not at a year's end. Not ever." "Good," she whispered, tears shining. "Because I'd be a fool to let go of you too." A new beginning, not an end. The reception that followed was a dazzling blur of candlelight and music. Ministers toasted to their health, children from her clinics arrived bearing tiny bouquets, and even the cynical royal aides couldn't hide their smiles when they saw how Zamir never once stepped more than a breath away from his bride. At one point in the evening, Fariha wandered toward the edge of the palace balcony, needing a moment to breathe. Zamir joined her almost instantly, sliding an arm around her waist. "Do you regret it?" he asked softly. "Doing this all again but for something as frightening as love?" She turned to face him, her hand resting over his heart. "No, not for a single moment. Because for the first time, there's no ledger to tally, no contracts, only us." Dash sparkles, the quiet promise. They stood there as lanterns floated into the night sky, each carrying a tiny handwritten prayer from their guests. Fariha watched them rise, her head tucked beneath Zamir's chin. "You know," she said after a moment, her voice mischievous, "if you hadn't chased me down in that study weeks ago, I might actually have run and ruined everything." He bent to kiss her hair, his smile crooked. "Never. I would have followed you to the ends of the earth. Or at least to your father's villa." She laughed, the sound bright and fearless. "Good, because that's all I ever wanted, Zamir. Not palaces or shareholders or even security. Just to know you'd fight for me, even if it meant chasing me barefoot across deserts. Then it's lucky I never learned how to stop chasing you." Above them, the final lanterns disappeared into the dark, carrying hopes that no longer felt like distant wishes. They had built this love slowly, clumsily, painfully, beautifully, until it was something neither could ever tear down. It wasn't a contract. It wasn't survival. It was simply forever.